Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. I think it's best served with a side of police officers and a heaping portion of legal documentation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story is about family, betrayal, and what happens when you push someone too far. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and 6 months ago, my own son had me committed to Sunset Manor Assisted Living while he moved into my fully paid-off 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs. The house where I'd raised him, the house where his father and I had spent 43 years of marriage, the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary in my golden years. Instead, I found myself sharing a room with Gladys Pemberton, who insisted on watching game shows at full volume and critiqued everything from my choice of pajamas to my fancy vocabulary. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career as a paralegal, helping lawyers navigate complex cases, making sure every detail was perfect. Yet here I was, legally powerless, while my 38-year-old son Derek systematically destroyed my life with forged documents and a fake medical evaluation. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Derek had always been what my late husband Frank would call creatively ambitious. Frank, bless his heart, was a CPA who lived by budgets and 5-year plans. Derek lived by whatever scheme looked promising that week. Over the years, Frank and I had bailed him out more times than I cared to count. Failed businesses, bad investments, credit card debt that seemed to multiply overnight. I remember when Derek was 12, he sold VIP pool passes to neighborhood kids for our backyard pool. The problem? Our pool was being renovated and was nothing but a muddy construction pit. When angry parents showed up, Derek calmly explained that he'd clearly advertised it as a construction experience pool and offered rain checks. Even then, Frank chuckled and said Derek would make a great salesman someday. I worried he'd make a great con artist. At 16, Derek forged Frank's signature to skip school for a casino trip with his girlfriend. When confronted, he claimed it was a college visit with educational tours. Frank believed him. I called the casino and learned they had no such program. At 18, Derek convinced us to co-sign for a reliable Honda that turned out to be a modified sports car. It broke down within a month and was repossessed when Derek stopped making payments. During his early 20s, Derek went through his entrepreneurial phase. Home renovation business, food truck venture, online clothing store, all failed spectacularly. Each time, Derek would appear with tears and speeches about how close he'd been to success. Frank would write another check. I'd watch Derek's face and see relief, not shame. At 22, Derek moved back home after his latest business venture, something involving cryptocurrency that he could never quite explain clearly. Went nowhere. He stayed for 8 months, during which time we discovered he'd been opening credit cards using our address without telling us. When confronted, Derek claimed it was a misunderstanding and that he'd planned to tell us but had been waiting for the right time. The right time, apparently, was never going to come. The credit card incident was my wake-up call. I started paying closer attention to Derek's stories, looking for inconsistencies. What I found alarmed me. Derek had developed an almost supernatural ability to justify any behavior, to reframe any failure as someone else's fault, to present himself as the victim of circumstances beyond his control. When I pointed out patterns in his behavior, he'd get angry and accuse me of not supporting him, of being negative and critical. Frank and I had our first real fight about Derek when he was 25. Derek had borrowed money from us to put down a deposit on an apartment, then came back a month later, saying the landlord had illegally kept the deposit and he needed more money for a different place. When I suggested Derek might be lying, Frank was furious with me. "He's our son, Eleanor," he said. "If we don't believe in him, who will?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek's problems weren't bad luck. They were bad choices. And worse, they were becoming calculated choices. At 28, Derek borrowed my car for what he said was a quick errand and returned it 3 days later, dented and nearly empty of gas. His story about helping a friend move across 3 states changed every time he told it. First, the friend was moving from Maryland to Virginia, then it was Maryland to North Carolina. By the third telling, Derek was claiming he'd been helping with a charity move for hurricane victims and couldn't understand why I was being so selfish about wear and tear on an old car. Frank always believed Derek's explanations. "He's got a good heart," Frank would say. "He just needs to find his direction." I started to suspect Derek's direction was always going to involve taking advantage of people who loved him. The pattern became even clearer when Derek got married to Jennifer. She was a sweet girl from a good family, and I could see she genuinely loved Derek. But I also noticed how Derek presented different versions of stories to different people. To Jennifer, he was the victim of demanding parents who didn't understand his entrepreneurial spirit. To us, he was the loving son trying to build a future worthy of his wonderful wife. To his in-laws, he was the ambitious young man working hard to provide for their daughter. Derek had become a master at reading people and telling them exactly what they wanted to hear. What worried me most was that I wasn't sure Derek even knew he was lying anymore. He seemed to genuinely believe whichever version of reality was most convenient at the moment. When Derek and Jennifer's first child was born, Derek went through what I can only describe as a personality transformation. Suddenly, every conversation was about his responsibilities as a father, his need to provide for his family, his concern about their financial future. He started making comments about how Frank and I were sitting on money that could help secure his children's education and future. "I'm not asking for handouts," Derek would say during Sunday dinners. "I'm talking about family investments, multi-generational wealth building. Some families understand that money should work for the whole family, not just get hoarded by one generation." Frank found these conversations inspiring. He'd talk about Derek's mature thinking and how proud he was that Derek was thinking long-term about family financial security. I found them calculating and manipulative. Derek wasn't expressing concern about his children's future. He was laying groundwork for larger financial requests. The requests started small, a few hundred for car repairs that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency, 1,000 for what Derek called essential home improvements, but looked like luxury upgrades, 5,000 for what Derek described as a once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity that would set the family up for generations, but turned out to be another get-rich-quick scheme. Each time, Derek would present detailed plans and projections. He'd talk about return on investment and family legacy, and how this money wasn't a loan, but a family partnership. Frank was impressed by Derek's business language and planning. I was concerned by how polished Derek's presentations had become. It felt like he was running a con on his own parents. When Frank died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, Derek's grief lasted exactly until the will reading. Frank had left everything to me: the house, savings, pension, everything. Derek got a modest inheritance, but only after I passed away. I could see the wheels turning in Derek's head during that meeting with the lawyer. "Mom," Derek said afterward, "I think Dad might have made a mistake with the will." You know how confused he was getting toward the end. Frank hadn't been confused at all. He'd been sharp as ever, right up until the heart attack. But Derek's comment made me realize he was already planning his next move. The next few months, Derek became the perfect son. Daily visits, offers to help with finances, suggestions about adding his name to accounts for emergencies. He'd bring Jennifer and their kids for family dinners, where they'd discuss my advanced age and how I might need support systems soon. "We're worried about you living alone in this big house," Derek would say. "What if something happened? What if you fell and couldn't get help? We think you should at least consider your options." Jennifer would chime in with concerns about my forgetfulness or fatigue. "Eleanor, you seem more tired lately. Are you getting enough sleep? Have you thought about getting some help around the house? Someone to check on you during the day?" Looking back, I realized these weren't innocent observations. They were building a case. Every normal sign of aging was being documented and magnified. Every minor memory lapse was treated as evidence of decline. Every time I chose to stay home instead of going out was characterized as isolation and withdrawal. That's when Derek started bringing Dr. Marcus Webb to family dinners. Supposedly a family friend and neurologist, Dr. Webb would make casual but concerned observations about my weight, my energy level, my memory. He'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my daily routine, my sleep patterns, my appetite. "Eleanor, you seem to have lost some weight since I last saw you," Dr. Webb would say over dessert. "Are you remembering to eat regular meals? Sometimes when we're grieving, we forget to take care of ourselves properly." Or, "That's an interesting story about your garden, Eleanor, but didn't you tell us something different about the roses last week?" Memory can be tricky when we're dealing with stress and grief. What Derek conveniently forgot to mention was that Dr. Webb had lost his medical license in 2 states for falsifying records and had gambling debts that made Derek's financial problems look minor. I found this out later, during my investigation, but at the time, I was starting to question myself. Was I forgetting things? Was I not taking care of myself properly? The psychological manipulation was subtle but relentless. Derek would ask me the same question twice in one conversation, then act concerned when I gave the same answer both times, saying I seemed stuck on certain topics. Jennifer would remind me of conversations I had no memory of having, then look worried when I couldn't recall them. Dr. Webb would make comments about how grief could affect cognitive function and how important it was to monitor changes in thinking and behavior. They were gaslighting me, though I didn't recognize it at the time. They were making me doubt my own perceptions, my own memory, my own competence. Every normal variation in mood or energy was treated as a symptom. Every forgotten detail was evidence of decline. Every preference for solitude was characterized as dangerous isolation. The trap was set beautifully. Derek had been documenting everything. The time I forgot where I put my car keys and spent 10 minutes looking for them before finding them in my purse where they always were. The afternoon I called him by his father's name while telling a story about their fishing trips, which any grieving widow might do. The evening I burned dinner because I was reading a particularly engrossing book and lost track of time, which apparently constituted evidence of dangerous cognitive decline. Derek had turned normal human behavior into a medical case study. He had photos of the slightly burnt chicken, timestamps of phone calls where I'd called him by Frank's name, detailed notes about every time I'd searched for something or asked the same question twice. Normal things that happened to everyone became evidence of decline in Derek's carefully crafted narrative. What scared me most was how professional it all looked. Derek had clearly researched dementia symptoms and was checking off boxes. Forgetfulness? Check. Confusion about names and dates? Check. Difficulty with familiar tasks like cooking? Check. He'd created a timeline that showed progressive deterioration over 6 months, when really it was just 6 months of normal grief and adjustment to living alone. The fake competency evaluation happened on a Tuesday in March, exactly 6 months after Frank's death. Dr. Webb showed up at my door unannounced, claiming Derek had called him because he was seriously concerned about my recent behavior. He had a medical bag and official-looking paperwork, and I was so confused by his sudden appearance that I let him in. Derek mentioned you've been having some difficulties lately, Dr. Webb said, settling himself at my kitchen table and pulling out forms. I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick cognitive assessment, just to establish a baseline and put everyone's minds at ease. His questions were designed to trip me up, though I didn't realize it at the time. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens while he shuffled papers loudly and tapped his pen against the table. Every time I paused to think, he'd interrupt with a comment about how long I was taking, or ask if I needed help remembering where I was. He showed me a picture of a clock face set to 3:15 and asked me what time it would be in 45 minutes. But when I looked closely, I realized the clock in the picture had no minute hand, just an hour hand pointing between the 3 and 4. When I pointed this out, he made a note with great flourish and muttered something about paranoid thinking and making excuses. He asked me to remember 3 words: apple, bicycle, and democracy, then spent 10 minutes asking rapid-fire questions about my medical history, my medications, my family relationships, my financial situation. The questions came so fast, I couldn't process them properly, and when he circled back to ask for the 3 words, I could only remember 2 of them. Mrs. Hartwell, he said with practiced solemnity, I'm afraid the results are quite concerning. You're showing clear signs of cognitive impairment and memory loss. Your son was right to be worried. For your own safety and well-being, you're going to need supervised care. I tried to argue, tried to point out that his questions had been confusing and his testing methods seemed unorthodox, but Dr. Webb just made more notes and nodded gravely. Denial is very common in cases like this, he told me. Many patients don't recognize their own limitations, which actually makes them more vulnerable to accidents and exploitation. By Friday, Derek had emergency guardianship. The speed should have been my first clue that something was wrong. In Pennsylvania, guardianship proceedings are supposed to take weeks, with mandatory waiting periods and court hearings and opportunities for the alleged incapacitated person to contest the petition. But Derek had somehow managed to get everything approved in 3 days, claiming my condition was deteriorating rapidly and that I was in immediate danger. By the following Monday, I was at Sunset Manor Assisted Living, and Derek was moving his family into my house. The transition happened so fast I could barely process it. On Tuesday, I was living independently in my own home. By Monday, I was sharing a room with a woman who insisted the TV volume be turned up to levels that could wake the dead, eating institutional food from plastic trays, and being told when I could shower and what activities I should participate in. "It's for your own good, Mom," Derek said when he came to visit on my second day. He brought flowers and spoke in the overly patient tone people use with children and the mentally impaired. "The staff here are trained to take care of people with your condition. You'll be much safer here, and we'll have peace of mind knowing you're being looked after properly." I tried to tell him that I felt fine, that I didn't need this level of care, that I wanted to go home. Derek just smiled sadly and patted my hand. "I know this is hard to accept, but Dr. Webb explained that lack of insight is part of the disease. You don't realize how much help you actually need." Jennifer was there too, looking uncomfortable, but supportive. "We cleaned out your closet and brought some of your favorite clothes," she said, gesturing to a suitcase that contained maybe a quarter of my wardrobe. "And we'll make sure to visit regularly." "What about my house?" I asked. "What about my things?" Derek and Jennifer exchanged a look I didn't like. "Don't worry about the house, Mom," Derek said. "We're taking care of everything. The important thing is that you focus on your health and getting adjusted to your new home." Something about the way he said "new home" made my blood run cold. This wasn't temporary. Derek wasn't planning for me to ever leave Sunset Manor. That night, lying in my narrow institutional bed, listening to Gladys snore and the sounds of the night shift making their rounds, I started to understand what had happened to me. Derek hadn't rescued me from a dangerous situation. He'd created a dangerous situation and then rescued me from it. He'd manufactured a medical crisis and positioned himself as the responsible son taking care of his declining mother. But Derek had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. 30 years as a paralegal teaches you a few things about the legal system. It teaches you that documentation is everything, that there's always a paper trail, and that amateur criminals, no matter how clever they think they are, always leave evidence. It also teaches you that the most important thing in any legal battle is knowing who your allies are and how to build a case systematically. Derek's first mistake was assuming that being at Sunset Manor would isolate me from people who could help. He didn't know that my roommate Gladys was a retired legal secretary who'd worked for the city's most prominent family law firm for 42 years. "Honey," Gladys said to me on my third day, pausing Judge Judy to look at me seriously, "that story you told me about how you ended up here? It stinks worse than Tuesday's fish special, and trust me, that's saying something." Gladys might have been 78 and addicted to game shows, but she had the sharp legal mind of someone who'd spent 4 decades managing complex cases. She started asking the right questions. Why had Derek been granted emergency guardianship without a proper hearing? Where was the mandatory 30-day notice period that's supposed to give family members time to object? Why hadn't I been appointed legal representation during the competency evaluation? "Either the system failed spectacularly," she said, adjusting her oversized glasses, "or somebody greased some wheels, and in my experience, wheels don't grease themselves." Derek's second mistake was underestimating the staff at Sunset Manor. While Derek saw them as minimum-wage workers who would ignore anything suspicious, I saw them as human beings with their own stories, families, and motivations. Margaret, the night nurse, was putting herself through law school and had a keen eye for inconsistencies. Bobby, the orderly, was an Army veteran who understood family betrayal. Sister Catherine, the facility director, had spent her entire career advocating for elderly patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. Margaret was particularly intrigued by my case. During her night shifts, when most residents were sleeping and the building was quiet, she'd sit with me at the nurses' station and go over the details of Derek's documentation. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said one night, spreading Derek's papers across the desk under the bright fluorescent lights, "I've seen legitimate competency evaluations, and this isn't one. Look at this timeline here. Your son filed for guardianship before the evaluation was even completed. That's not legal procedure." She pointed to dates and signatures, explaining how the process was supposed to work. "You should have had notice of the petition. You should have had the opportunity to hire your own attorney. You should have had a hearing where you could contest the allegations. None of that happened." Bobby, meanwhile, had his own insights into family betrayal. As a veteran, he'd seen plenty of family members try to take advantage of disabled service members for their disability benefits and VA benefits. "It's always the people closest to you," he told me, while helping me to the physical therapy room. "They figure they know you won't fight back because you love them. That's what makes it so evil. They weaponize your own love against you. Sister Catherine was more circumspect, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She'd been in healthcare administration for 30 years and had seen every type of family dynamic imaginable. She started asking subtle questions about my medical history, my relationship with Derek, and my understanding of my legal situation. "Eleanor," she said during one of our weekly check-ins, "I want you to know that if you ever feel your rights aren't being respected, there are advocacy services available. Sometimes families make decisions they think are best, but that doesn't mean those decisions are legally sound or in the person's actual best interests." Derek's third and most critical mistake was getting cocky. Within 2 weeks of moving into my house, Derek was posting photos on social media of his new home office, which happened to be Frank's carefully organized study where he'd kept all of our important documents. Derek showed off the renovations they were planning, the new furniture they were buying, and the neighborhood barbecues they were hosting. He was living his best life in my house, on my dime, while I was supposed to be quietly deteriorating in institutional care. But while Derek was playing house, I was playing the long game. My breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Harold Finch, another Sunset Manor resident who'd been a private investigator for 30 years before his stroke. Harold could barely speak, but his mind was razor sharp, and he'd been following my story with interest. During one of our shared meals in the dining room, he slipped me a note written in shaky handwriting. "Check ink dates on signatures. Criminals always mess up details." That's when I realized Derek's amateur hour fraud had left clues everywhere. With Margaret's help, I got access to a computer in the facility's library, supposedly for cognitive therapy, and to help with my memory exercises. Margaret was fascinated by the legal aspects of my case and saw it as real-world experience for her law studies. Together, we started building a counter case, documenting everything we could find about Derek's documentation. The more we dug, the more obvious Derek's fraud became. Wrong pen types for supposed signature dates, medical records with contradictory symptoms. My actual doctor had given me clean cognitive health just weeks before Derek's diagnosis. Gladys, meanwhile, was working her network of legal contacts. 42 years in the legal field meant she knew everyone, and everyone owed her favors. She made phone calls during her social hour time, reaching out to retired lawyers, active paralegals, and courthouse clerks who remembered her fondly. "Honey," she announced one afternoon while Judge Judy blared in the background, "I found your smoking gun." 3 different people at the courthouse remember Derek pressuring them about expedited guardianship procedures. He was asking very specific questions about how to bypass normal waiting periods and notification requirements. That's not the behavior of someone concerned about their mother's well-being. That's the behavior of someone planning a heist. She connected me with Patricia Sanchez, a disability rights attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Patricia agreed to meet with me at Sunset Manor under the guise of a legal education seminar that Sister Catherine had arranged for interested residents. Patricia took one look at Derek's paperwork and started laughing. Not polite, professional laughter, but the kind of genuine amusement that comes from seeing something so obviously fraudulent it's almost insulting. "Your son," Patricia said during our first meeting, "is either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant. Probably both." The forged signatures were obvious. Derek had practiced my handwriting, but made crucial mistakes with pen types and pressure patterns. Dr. Webb's evaluation used a debunked cognitive test. The timeline contradicted my actual medical records. But Patricia's investigation revealed something even worse. Derek had been running a long con for months. Bank records showed systematic transfers to his accounts, credit cards opened in my name, even a car loan using my social security number without my knowledge. "We have a solid criminal case," Patricia explained. "Elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, forgery. Your son is looking at serious prison time. Now, a reasonable person might have immediately filed criminal charges and let the legal system handle everything. But I'd spent 6 months watching Derek live in my house, sleep in my bedroom, and post photos of himself hosting parties on my deck. I'd spent 6 months eating institutional food, sharing a bathroom with someone who thought Wheel of Fortune was high art, and being patronized by nursing staff who spoke to me like I was a confused child. I wanted more than legal justice. I wanted Derek to feel as powerless and humiliated as he'd made me feel." The inspiration came during one of Gladys's true crime show marathons. We were watching a documentary about white-collar crime, and one of the convicted fraudsters was describing how he'd felt invincible right up until the moment FBI agents walked into his office during a board meeting. "That's it," I told Gladys. Derek feels untouchable because he thinks I'm helpless. He's gotten careless and cocky. He's celebrating his victory while the evidence of his crimes is scattered all over social media for everyone to see. Derek's 39th birthday was approaching, and according to his very public social media posts, he was planning a huge celebration. He'd invited half the neighborhood, all his college friends, extended family members, and even some of his work colleagues. The party was being held at Derek's house, though he was still careful not to explicitly claim ownership in writing, the sly little fraud. That's when I had what you might call an inspiration. Patricia was initially reluctant when I explained my plan. Eleanor, I understand you want to make a statement, but showing up uninvited could complicate our legal position. If we appear vindictive or theatrical, it might hurt our credibility in court. Not uninvited, I corrected. I'm arriving with proper legal documentation, law enforcement witnesses, and media coverage. It's not a confrontation. It's a lawful restoration of property rights with full transparency. Margaret was more enthusiastic. Mrs. Hartwell, that's brilliant. You're not just getting your house back. You're exposing Derek's lies to everyone who believed them. All those people who pitied him for having to care for his declining mother will see exactly what kind of man he really is. Even Sister Catherine, who usually preached forgiveness and reconciliation, seemed intrigued by the plan. Eleanor, I've seen too many families take advantage of elderly relatives. Sometimes public accountability is the only thing that creates real consequences and prevents future victims. It took some convincing, but Patricia eventually agreed that my approach, while theatrical, was perfectly legal. The paperwork restoring my competency and legal rights had been filed and approved. The criminal investigation into Derek's fraud was ongoing, and I had every legal right to reclaim my own property. The preparations took 2 weeks and involved more coordination than D-Day. Patricia worked with the district attorney's office to coordinate the timing. I worked with Gladys to ensure we had media coverage. Her nephew worked for the local newspaper, and one of the night nurses had a daughter who freelanced for the regional television station. Sister Catherine, bless her, arranged for a discharge ceremony that coincidentally coincided with Derek's party timeline. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would arrive at Derek's birthday celebration with legal documentation proving my competency, law enforcement to witness the property reclamation, and media to ensure the story reached the public. Derek would be humiliated in front of everyone he'd been lying to, and his fraud would be exposed in the most public way possible. Margaret helped me prepare for the confrontation like a lawyer prepping a star witness. We rehearsed responses to Derek's likely objections, reviewed the legal documentation until I could quote it from memory, and even practiced my entrance to ensure maximum dramatic impact. Remember, Margaret said during one of our practice sessions, you're not angry Eleanor anymore, you're triumphant Eleanor. You're the woman who outsmarted her own son and reclaimed her life. Walk into that party like you own the place, because you do. The day of Derek's birthday party was absolutely perfect. Clear skies, mild temperature, ideal for an outdoor celebration. Derek had rented a tent for the backyard, hired a catering company, and even brought in a DJ. According to the neighborhood group chat that Gladys had somehow gained access to through her network of contacts, it was shaping up to be the social event of the season. I spent the morning getting ready for my own celebration. Margaret helped me choose my outfit, a navy blue dress that Frank had always loved, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent, dignified woman who had been temporarily displaced but was now ready to reclaim her life. You look beautiful, Mrs. Hartwell, Margaret said, adjusting my necklace one final time. Your husband would be so proud of what you've accomplished. Patricia arrived at Sunset Manor at 2 p.m. with a folder full of legal documents and a satisfied smile. Everything's in order, she announced. The court has officially restored your competency. Your power of attorney is nullified, and Derek's guardianship is terminated. As of today, you are legally and officially back in control of your life and your assets. The police arrived at 2:30. Detective Rodriguez had been briefed on the situation and understood that while this was technically a civil matter, the fraud and identity theft aspects made it a potential criminal scene. He brought 2 other officers, partly for crowd control and partly because, as he later told me, he'd never participated in such a satisfying restoration of justice. Mrs. Hartwell, Detective Rodriguez said, reviewing the paperwork one final time, I want you to know that what your son did to you was unconscionable. I've been working elder abuse cases for 15 years, and this level of premeditation is rare. You should be proud of yourself for fighting back. By 3 p.m., we had assembled quite an entourage. Patricia and her legal assistant, 3 police officers, a newspaper reporter, a television crew, Sister Catherine as a character witness, and Gladys, who had insisted on coming along for what she called the best entertainment I've seen in decades. "Honey," Gladys said, applying fresh lipstick in the back seat of Patricia's car, "I wouldn't miss this for anything. This is better than anything they show on court TV." The caravan of cars pulling up to my house created exactly the kind of commotion I had hoped for. Derek's party was in full swing. I could hear music, laughter, and the sound of people enjoying themselves on my property, eating food purchased with my money, celebrating the birthday of a man who had committed multiple felonies to steal my life. The neighbors started gathering on their front porches, curious about the official-looking vehicles descending on Derek's celebration. Some of them waved at me, recognizing me as the woman who used to live there, probably wondering what was happening. Derek appeared at the front door looking confused and slightly panicked. He was wearing a ridiculous Hawaiian shirt and holding a beer, clearly not expecting any interruption to his festivities. His face went through several expressions when he saw me: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of angry resignation. "Mom?" he said, as if he wasn't sure I was real. "What are you doing here? You can't just leave the facility without permission." I smiled my sweetest smile, the one I'd perfected during 40 years of marriage to his father. "Hello, Derek. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I brought you a present." I handed him the legal documents restoring my competency. He took them automatically, still processing what was happening. "What is this?" he asked, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. "It's my sanity," I said cheerfully. "Turns out I never actually lost it. Funny how that works." Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, badge clearly visible. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Detective Rodriguez. We need to discuss some irregularities regarding your guardianship documentation and your mother's living situation." By now, the party guests had begun gathering around, drawn by the obvious drama. I recognized several neighbors, some of Derek's college friends, and a few family members who looked mortified to be witnessing this scene. Jennifer emerged from the backyard, carrying their youngest child and looking pale. "There's been a mistake," Derek said, his voice rising slightly. "My mother has dementia. She can't live independently. The courts agreed. That's why I have legal guardianship." Patricia stepped forward with a second folder. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell, the courts have reviewed your documentation and found significant irregularities. Your mother's competency evaluation has been invalidated and your guardianship has been terminated. As of today, Mrs. Hartwell has full legal control of her assets and property." I watched Derek's face as the implications sank in. The house he'd been living in for 6 months wasn't his. The money he'd been spending wasn't his. The life he'd built on the foundation of my supposed incompetence was about to crumble. "This is ridiculous," he said, looking around at the gathering crowd as if expecting support. "She's not well. She can't take care of herself. Someone could take advantage of her." I laughed, and it felt wonderful. Oh, Derek, someone did take advantage of me. The person I trusted most in the world, my own son. The television camera was rolling now, capturing everything. The newspaper reporter was scribbling notes. The neighbors were whispering among themselves, clearly realizing they'd been unknowingly participating in a celebration of theft. Mrs. Patterson from next door stepped forward, looking confused. "Eleanor, we thought you were—" "Derek said you had Alzheimer's and couldn't recognize people anymore." "Apparently," I said, turning to address the gathering crowd. "My son has been telling quite a few stories about my condition. The truth is, I'm as sharp as I ever was. Sharp enough to figure out that he forged my signature on legal documents, bribed a disgraced doctor to declare me incompetent, and stole my house while I was illegally committed to a nursing home." A murmur went through the crowd. These people had believed Derek's lies, had probably pitied him for having to care for his demented mother while enjoying his beautiful new home. Now they were realizing they'd been celebrating with a criminal. "I'm going to need you to vacate the premises, Mr. Hartwell," Detective Rodriguez said formally. "This property belongs to your mother, and she's exercising her right to reclaim it." "You can't just kick me out," Derek protested. "I have nowhere to go. My family lives here now." "Funny," I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling through his social media posts. "According to Facebook, you've been living in your new house and making your own family memories. I assumed you'd purchased this property. Were you lying to your friends about owning this house, Derek? The crowd was completely silent now. Even the DJ had stopped the music. Jennifer appeared at Derek's side, looking pale and carrying their youngest child. Eleanor, she said carefully, surely we can work something out. Derek was only trying to help you. He was protecting your interests. I turned to Jennifer with genuine curiosity. Protecting my interests by forging my signature on legal documents? By having me declared incompetent based on a fraudulent medical evaluation? By moving into my house and spending my money while I shared a nursing home room with someone who thinks game shows are documentaries? You don't understand, Derek said desperately. You were confused. You were making bad decisions. I was protecting you from yourself. Protected me right into institutional care while you redecorated my bedroom, I replied. How thoughtful. Detective Rodriguez was losing patience. Mr. Hartwell, you have 30 minutes to gather personal belongings. Any property that belongs to Mrs. Hartwell remains here. We'll need to discuss the criminal charges at a later time. Criminal charges? Jennifer asked, her voice barely a whisper. Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out another folder. Elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and forgery. There's also the matter of the credit cards Derek opened in your mother-in-law's name and the loans he secured using her social security number. Jennifer stared at Derek with growing horror. Derek, what did you do? For a moment, Derek's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. I did what I had to do. She's old. She wasn't going to live much longer anyway. Why should that money just sit there when we needed it now? When the kids needed college funds and we had bills to pay, I was thinking about the family's future. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Derek had just confessed to stealing from his elderly mother in front of dozens of witnesses, a police officer, and a television camera. Well, I said calmly, I suppose that answers the question of whether you have any remorse. The party guests began dispersing quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I watched them go with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These people had been celebrating with Derek while believing his lies about my condition. They'd eaten food purchased with my stolen money and enjoyed themselves in my stolen house. Uncle Robert, Frank's brother, approached me with tears in his eyes. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. Derek said you'd specifically asked not to see family because it upset you too much. Another lie, I said gently. I would have loved to see family. I spent 6 months thinking you'd all forgotten about me. Derek spent the next 20 minutes gathering clothes and personal items while Jennifer loaded their children into their car. The birthday party decorations remained up, creating a surreal backdrop for this forced eviction. The rented tent, the catering table full of food, the DJ equipment, all of it a monument to Derek's hubris. As Derek carried his final box to the car, he stopped in front of me one last time. I hope you're happy, he said bitterly. You've destroyed your own family, Mom. You've made your grandchildren homeless. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding of what he'd done. I saw only self-pity and anger. Derek, I said quietly, I didn't destroy this family. You did, the moment you decided to steal my life instead of building your own. You had choices. You could have asked for help. You could have been honest about your financial problems. You could have worked with me to find solutions. Instead, you chose to commit fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft. Those were your choices, not mine. He stood there for a moment, perhaps waiting for me to soften, to offer forgiveness or assistance. When it became clear that wasn't happening, he walked away. The police cars left. The news crew packed up their equipment. Patricia stayed to help me assess what had been damaged or removed from the house. It was mostly intact, though Derek had clearly gone through Frank's office and removed several important documents. Those would be recovered as part of the criminal investigation. As the sun set, I found myself standing in my own living room for the first time in 6 months. The furniture was mostly the same, though Derek had rearranged things to his taste. The family photos had been removed from the mantelpiece and replaced with pictures of Derek's family. My books had been packed away to make room for his electronics. It would take time to restore the house to the way I liked it. It would take longer to process the betrayal, to understand how my relationship with my son had deteriorated to the point where he could justify stealing my entire life. And it would take much longer to decide whether forgiveness was possible or even advisable. But as I stood in my own home, legally competent and financially independent, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: freedom. The local news aired the story that evening. Elderly woman reclaims life after son's fraud scheme. The newspaper ran a longer piece the next day, focusing on the broader issues of elder abuse and the warning signs families should watch for. Derek's story became a cautionary tale about greed, desperation, and the dangers of underestimating elderly family members. The legal consequences for Derek were significant. The criminal charges included elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and forgery. The civil penalties included full restitution for the money he'd stolen, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. His fraudulent guardianship also triggered an investigation into Dr. Webb, who lost his remaining medical license and faced his own criminal charges. Derek eventually plea bargained to avoid prison time, accepting 5 years of probation, community service, and a permanent restraining order preventing him from contacting me or accessing any of my financial accounts. He was also required to undergo financial counseling and psychological evaluation. Jennifer filed for divorce 6 months later. She moved back to her mother's house with the children and started the process of rebuilding her life. I felt sorry for her and the kids. They were victims of Derek's fraud, as much as I was, in their own way. The house felt different after everything that happened. It was still my home, but it carried the weight of betrayal now. I considered selling it and starting over somewhere else, but that felt too much like letting Derek win. Instead, I made changes. I renovated Frank's office, turning it into a bright studio space where I could pursue the photography hobby I'd never had time for during my working years. I converted Derek's old bedroom into a library. I had a security system installed and changed all the locks. Most importantly, I made new friends. The experience at Sunset Manor had shown me that there were people everywhere, fighting their own battles, overcoming their own challenges, proving that age doesn't mean irrelevance. Margaret finished law school and now works for Patricia's firm, specializing in elder advocacy. Gladys and I maintained our friendship, though she moved to a nicer facility closer to her daughter. Sister Catherine and I correspond regularly, and I've become a volunteer advocate for nursing home residents who might be experiencing abuse or exploitation. Harold Finch, the retired private investigator who'd given me the tip about checking ink dates, became one of my closest friends. Despite his speech difficulties, we developed a way of communicating that worked for both of us. He helped me understand how to spot fraud patterns, and I helped him with legal research for cases he consulted on from his nursing home. The birthday party invasion became legendary in my neighborhood. People still mention it at block parties and community events. Remember when Eleanor reclaimed her house with police backup? It's become shorthand for not underestimating people based on age or appearance. Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor, later told me she'd suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to address it. Derek's story never quite added up, she said. You went from being perfectly normal to supposedly having severe dementia overnight. That's not how Alzheimer's works. I learned something important during those 6 months at Sunset Manor. Being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. Having health challenges doesn't mean being incompetent. And being betrayed by family doesn't mean being defeated. Sometimes it just means finding out who you really are when everything familiar is stripped away. Derek occasionally attempts to contact me through intermediaries, usually around holidays or when he's having financial troubles. He wants reconciliation, forgiveness, a return to the family relationship we once had. But some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome. When your own child decides you're worth more to them legally dead than actually alive, when they're willing to steal your freedom, your dignity, and your autonomy for money, that's not a family relationship worth preserving. I don't miss Derek. I miss the son I thought I had, the man I hoped he might become. But the person who forged my signature and had me declared incompetent isn't my child in any meaningful sense. He's just a criminal who happened to share my DNA. The money Derek stole has been mostly recovered, though some of it had been spent on non-recoverable items like vacations and restaurants. The house has been restored to my preferences. The legal documentation establishing my competency is ironclad, and my life, interrupted but not destroyed, continues. I'm 73 now, living independently, traveling when I want to, managing my own finances, and making my own decisions. I have friends who respect my intelligence, neighbors who check on me by choice rather than obligation, and hobbies that bring me joy. It's not the life I expected to have after Frank's death, but it's the life I chose to build after Derek's betrayal. The most satisfying part of this entire experience wasn't the dramatic confrontation at Derek's birthday party, though that was admittedly enjoyable. It wasn't seeing him face criminal charges, though justice was important. It was proving to myself that I could fight back, that I could outsmart someone who thought he was smarter than me, and that I could rebuild my life even stronger than before. Derek thought he was stealing my future. Instead, he gave me the opportunity to discover exactly how strong, resourceful, and determined I really am. That might not have been the birthday gift he intended to give me, but it's the one I'll treasure most. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not trying to work things out with Derek privately, if the public humiliation was necessary. My answer is always the same. Derek didn't steal from me privately. He stole from me systematically with premeditation and with the help of accomplices. He lied to family, friends, and neighbors about my condition. He celebrated his theft publicly, posting photos of his life in my house on social media. Why should his downfall be any less public than his crime? The truth is, Derek needed to be exposed, not just for my sake, but for the sake of other elderly people who might be targeted by similar schemes. Elder abuse thrives in silence and shame. It depends on victims being too embarrassed or hopeless to fight back. By making my story public, I helped other families recognize the warning signs and gave other victims the courage to speak up. I receive letters from people who've seen my story and recognize similar patterns in their own families. Adult children who've been gradually taking control of their parents' finances. Family members who've been pushing for unnecessary guardianships. Elderly people who've been told they're not competent to make their own decisions when they're actually perfectly capable. Knowledge is power, and I used my knowledge of the legal system to reclaim my life. But more importantly, I used my experience to help others do the same. That's become my mission now, advocating for elderly people who are being victimized by the people who should be protecting them. Frank used to say that every ending is really a beginning in disguise. I thought my story was ending when Derek had me committed to Sunset Manor. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I'm the hero instead of the victim. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.